It was December 7, 1941, a date etched into history with the same clarity as a photograph frozen in time. The sudden roar of explosions, the screams of men, and the sight of plumes of smoke rising over Pearl Harbor marked the moment the United States could no longer remain a distant observer in the global war that had already engulfed Europe and Asia. Before that day, isolationist sentiment dominated American politics, with most citizens reluctant to intervene in a conflict thousands of miles away. Yet the attack shattered complacency, waking the nation to the reality that global events could not be ignored, and that the future of freedom, security, and American influence was now inextricably linked to the outcome of a war fought on multiple continents. Within hours of the assault, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling it a date which will live in infamy, and urging a declaration of war against Japan. The nation that had watched Europe and Asia from the sidelines was now fully immersed in a global struggle that would test its military, political, and economic capacities like never before. The immediate response was electrifying. Young men enlisted by the thousands, factories converted overnight from civilian production to the machinery of war, and entire communities mobilized to support troops abroad. The United States' industrial and technological might became the backbone of the Allied effort, providing tanks, planes, ships, and ammunition on a scale unmatched in history. Yet entering the war was not merely a question of military logistics, it was also a matter of strategy. American leaders had to decide how to allocate resources across two vastly different theaters, the European conflict against Germany and Italy, and the Pacific War against Japan, which now threatened the very security of the American homeland and its Pacific allies. Military planners debated, sometimes heatedly, over whether the focus should be Europe first or Pacific first. The decision would shape the deployment of troops, the timing of offensives, and the overall conduct of the war. In the European theater, the United States worked closely with Britain and other Allied nations to halt the spread of Nazi aggression. Early campaigns, such as the North African and Italian operations, tested American forces against seasoned German troops and harsh environmental conditions. Soldiers faced not only the enemy but also the challenge of navigating unfamiliar terrain and coordinating with allies whose tactics and military cultures differed from their own. Yet these early experiences proved invaluable, providing lessons in coordination, adaptability, and leadership that would inform later operations, including the massive Normandy invasion. Behind the battle lines, American diplomacy was equally critical. Roosevelt's administration negotiated supply routes, intelligence sharing, and long-term strategic planning with Churchill and, indirectly, with Stalin, seeking to maintain unity among allies with sometimes divergent priorities. The Pacific theater presented an entirely different set of challenges. Japan's early successes in 1941 to 1942, including rapid conquests of the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, left the Allies reeling. American forces faced the difficult task of slowing Japanese expansion while simultaneously building the strength necessary for a counteroffensive. The strategy of island hopping, pioneered by commanders in the Pacific, aimed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and seize strategically important islands to serve as stepping stones toward Japan itself. Each battle was brutal, marked by dense jungles, entrenched defenders, and the relentless tropical climate. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen faced unprecedented hazards, and the cost in lives and material was immense. Yet every small victory in the Pacific brought the United States closer to a decisive confrontation that would ultimately determine the fate of the region. While military operations raged, the home front became a critical pillar of the war effort. Factories hummed day and night, producing planes, tanks, and ships at a staggering pace. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles traditionally reserved for men and proving themselves indispensable to national production. Propaganda campaigns emphasized sacrifice, unity, and patriotism, encouraging civilians to support rationing, bond purchases, and volunteer work. The war permeated daily life, transforming schools, neighborhoods, and industries, and fostering a sense of collective purpose that had not been seen since the First World War. Scientific research accelerated as well, giving rise to innovations such as radar, jet engines, and, ultimately, the Manhattan Project, a top-secret initiative that would harness atomic energy in a weapon capable of reshaping the future of warfare. Leadership decisions were crucial throughout these years. Roosevelt and his military advisors had to balance short-term operational needs with long-term strategic goals. Every deployment, every convoy, and every diplomatic communication carried enormous weight, as mistakes could prolong the war or result in catastrophic losses. The coordination with Britain was especially delicate. Churchill, whose nation had been fighting a prolonged battle for survival since 1939, pressed for immediate assaults on Europe to relieve pressure on British forces, while American planners often advocated for more measured approaches, ensuring that U.S. troops were adequately trained and equipped. At the same time, the United States maintained a careful watch on the Soviet Union, an ally of convenience against Hitler but a potential rival in the post-war world. The seeds of both cooperation and tension were sown in these years, as leaders navigated the complex interplay of military necessity, political pressure, and future planning. The war also catalyzed profound social and cultural shifts. Racial segregation in the military and defense industries highlighted ongoing inequalities, prompting debates about civil rights that would continue for decades. Immigrant communities contributed labor and resources, reinforcing the nation's diverse character even as they faced suspicion and discrimination. The urgency of global conflict accelerated social change, revealing both the possibilities and limits of a society striving for unity amid crisis. The American public, confronted with the reality of total war, became increasingly aware of the interconnectedness of domestic life and international events. Newsreels, radio broadcasts, and newspaper coverage brought the distant theaters of Europe and the Pacific into living rooms across the country, shaping public opinion and reinforcing the moral imperative of victory. By 1943, the United States had transitioned from a reluctant participant to a central actor in the global conflict. Victories in North Africa and the Solomon Islands demonstrated the growing effectiveness of American strategy and logistics. Coordination with allied nations strengthened, while domestic production continued to fuel the war effort at an unprecedented pace. The United States had proven its ability to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, balancing the demands of the Pacific and European theaters while preparing for the decisive campaigns that would bring the war to a close. Yet the path forward remained perilous, as each victory brought new challenges and each defeat underscored the costs of failure. Ultimately, the entry of the United States into World War II reshaped both the conflict and the nation itself. Military innovation, industrial capacity, and diplomatic engagement combined to create a force capable of influencing events across the globe. At the same time, the war accelerated social change, challenged traditional norms, and laid the groundwork for America's emergence as a post-war superpower. From the shock of Pearl Harbor to the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific and the planning for a final assault on Europe, these early years demonstrated that the United States was no longer an observer of history but an active shaper of it. The choices made, the sacrifices endured, and the strategies devised during this period would not only determine the outcome of the Second World War but also redefine the nation's role in a rapidly changing world. Strategic decisions and the Europe First policy. The war was no longer a distant thunderstorm. By early 1942, it had become a storm the United States could not simply weather, it had to direct. American leaders faced the monumental task of deciding where to strike first and how to manage resources across two vastly different and distant theaters. The debate over strategy was intense, and it revolved around a deceptively simple question: which enemy posed the greater threat, Hitler's Germany in Europe or Japan in the Pacific? President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his top military advisors concluded that the Axis powers had to be approached differently. They ultimately embraced the Europe First strategy, a decision rooted in both pragmatism and geopolitics, but one that carried significant consequences for the Pacific front. By prioritizing the defeat of Germany, the United States and its allies recognized that the industrial and military might of the Third Reich, if left unchecked, could dominate the European continent and threaten the Soviet Union, Britain, and eventually the global balance of power. This strategy required a careful balancing act. Resources were finite, and American planners knew that victory in Europe would demand vast troop deployments, extensive logistical support, and close coordination with the British and later the Soviets. The North African campaign became the first practical test of this approach. In November 1942, Operation Torch landed American and British forces in Algeria and Morocco, aiming to push Axis forces out of North Africa. It was a baptism of fire for U.S. troops, many of whom were inexperienced and facing German and Italian forces seasoned by years of fighting. The campaign revealed the importance of coordination, not only between nations but also between different branches of the military. Ground forces had to be synchronized with naval and air operations, supply lines stretched across deserts, and intelligence continuously updated to respond to rapidly changing conditions. Despite initial setbacks, the campaign eventually succeeded, culminating in the surrender of Axis forces in North Africa by May 1943. From North Africa, the Allies moved into Italy, a campaign that was both strategically important and politically symbolic. Italy's surrender in September 1943 demonstrated the vulnerability of the Axis powers and opened a southern front in Europe, but the fighting was grueling. Italian terrain favored defenders, and German troops quickly established fortified positions in the mountains. American and British soldiers faced bitter resistance, harsh winter conditions, and logistical challenges in moving men and equipment through rugged landscapes. Yet, these experiences forged valuable lessons in combined operations, amphibious assaults, and coalition warfare, preparing the Allies for the even larger and more complex D-Day invasion the following year. At the same time, the Italian campaign forced American planners to maintain flexibility, balancing the need for European victories with the pressing threat of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the war was a very different kind of struggle. Japan's early victories had left a chain of occupied islands stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Each island became a strategic objective, a stepping stone toward Japan itself. The U.S. military, led by commanders like Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, implemented the island-hopping strategy, deliberately bypassing heavily fortified islands to capture those that offered airfields, harbors, and supply bases. This approach conserved resources while steadily advancing American forces closer to the Japanese mainland. Battles such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan were characterized by intense combat, with soldiers facing not only enemy fire but also disease, tropical conditions, and the psychological strain of relentless fighting. Every victory in the Pacific required meticulous planning, integration of naval, air, and ground forces, and a willingness to accept staggering human and material costs. The coordination between theaters posed additional challenges. Transporting troops, ships, and supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific demanded unprecedented logistical effort. American industry had to sustain production for two vastly different types of warfare simultaneously, the heavy armor, vehicles, and artillery needed in Europe, and the naval fleets, aircraft, and amphibious craft required in the Pacific. Supply chains stretched from factories in the Midwest to ports on both coasts, then across thousands of miles of ocean to the front lines. Technological innovations, including improved radar, amphibious landing vehicles, and long-range bombers, played a critical role in maintaining momentum in both theaters. Behind every battlefield victory was a vast and largely invisible network of planners, engineers, and logisticians ensuring that soldiers and sailors had the equipment and support necessary to achieve their objectives. Diplomacy was as critical as battlefield strategy. Roosevelt and Churchill worked tirelessly to maintain the alliance with the Soviet Union, whose forces bore the brunt of German military might on the Eastern Front. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin demanded that the Western Allies open a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on Soviet forces and accelerate Germany's defeat. These negotiations required careful diplomacy, as the United States had to reassure the Soviet Union of its commitment while simultaneously managing public opinion and military readiness. The groundwork laid in these early discussions would eventually culminate in the planning for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy, which would mark a turning point in the European War. The Europe First policy also had political implications at home. American citizens, enraged by the attack on Pearl Harbor, demanded swift action in the Pacific, yet national leaders consistently emphasized the necessity of defeating Hitler first. Public communications, speeches, and news coverage sought to maintain morale and explain the rationale behind this strategy. American society, already mobilized for war production and military service, had to adjust to a reality in which victory would come only through patience, coordination, and sustained effort over multiple fronts. The challenge of balancing the demands of domestic opinion with the imperatives of global strategy highlighted the complexity of total war in a modern industrialized society. By late 1943, the United States had established itself as a central actor in both theaters. Successes in North Africa, the Solomon Islands, and other early campaigns demonstrated the growing competence of American forces. Industrial production continued to expand, scientific research accelerated, and the coordination with allied nations deepened. The groundwork was being laid for the decisive operations of 1944 and 1945, including the Normandy landings, the liberation of France, and the final campaigns in the Pacific that would bring Japan to its knees. The Europe First strategy, while controversial at the time, provided a coherent framework for allocating resources, managing multiple theaters, and sustaining the Allied coalition against the Axis powers. In retrospect, these early strategic decisions exemplified the ability of the United States to balance competing priorities on an unprecedented scale. Military planning, industrial production, and diplomatic negotiation converged to create a force capable of influencing events across two oceans simultaneously. The war was no longer fought by isolated nations, it was a global endeavor in which American leadership, strategy, and innovation became indispensable. From the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific, the United States demonstrated that total victory required not only bravery on the battlefield but also foresight, organization, and an unwavering commitment to long-term strategic goals. Ultimately, the Europe First policy reflected a profound understanding of the interconnectedness of the global conflict. Defeating Germany was essential to securing Europe, supporting allies, and preserving the post-war balance of power. At the same time, the Pacific theater required continuous attention, innovation, and sacrifice. The success of this dual-front strategy laid the foundation for the eventual Allied victory and underscored the United States' emergence as a global superpower, capable of projecting force, coordinating coalitions, and shaping the future of the international order. Diplomacy and the shaping of Allied strategy. By 1943, the United States had firmly established itself as a critical player in the global struggle, not only through military engagement but also through skillful diplomacy. Victory on the battlefield required more than sheer force, it demanded coordination among nations whose goals, cultures, and priorities were sometimes at odds. The Allies faced a delicate balance, defeating Axis powers efficiently while ensuring post-war stability. Nowhere was this challenge more evident than in the series of high-level conferences that defined strategy and cemented alliances, beginning with the pivotal Tehran Conference in late 1943. The Tehran Conference marked the first time Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin convened in person. The stakes were immense. The Soviet Union had borne enormous losses confronting Hitler's forces on the Eastern Front, while Britain and the United States were preparing for large-scale offensives in Western Europe. Stalin's demands were clear: he sought a second front to relieve pressure on his armies and to ensure a swift German defeat. Roosevelt and Churchill had already committed to a gradual buildup of forces in Britain and North Africa, but Tehran offered a critical opportunity to align these strategies, coordinate timing, and solidify trust among the Allies. The discussions were tense, often strained by mutual suspicion, language barriers, and differing war experiences, yet the outcomes were decisive. Operation Overlord, the long-planned invasion of Normandy, was officially agreed upon, setting the stage for the liberation of Western Europe and signaling a turning point in the conflict. Diplomacy at Tehran was about more than military coordination. Roosevelt understood that the Soviet Union's sacrifices had implications for post-war politics. Issues such as the boundaries of Eastern Europe, influence in liberated nations, and the mechanisms of post-war reconstruction required delicate negotiation. While Churchill and Roosevelt sometimes resisted Stalin's expansive demands, they recognized the necessity of compromise to maintain a unified front against Germany. The conference highlighted a central challenge of wartime diplomacy, balancing immediate military needs with the long-term political landscape. Decisions made in Tehran would influence not only the conduct of the war but also the shape of the post-war world, illustrating how the United States increasingly assumed a leadership role in global governance. While Tehran focused on Europe, the United States also turned its attention to economic stability and reconstruction. By 1944, Allied leaders were considering the structures that would prevent future economic crises and global instability. The Bretton Woods Conference, held in New Hampshire, brought together representatives from 44 nations to design a new international financial system. Delegates recognized that the interwar period had exposed the dangers of uncoordinated economic policies, trade barriers, and volatile currencies. The United States, leveraging its wartime economic strength, championed the creation of institutions that would stabilize global finance, promote reconstruction, and encourage trade. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, was established to oversee currency exchange rates and provide financial assistance to nations in need, while the World Bank was designed to fund long-term development projects. These institutions reflected a profound shift. America was not only a military power but also a central architect of the post-war economic order. The combination of military and economic diplomacy reflected a broader understanding of power in the modern world. Success required integrating battlefield operations with financial planning, logistical coordination, and political negotiation. For instance, resources allocated to Europe had to account for both immediate combat needs and the eventual reconstruction of war-torn regions. The United States assumed responsibility for supplying allies, managing lend-lease programs, and supporting economies devastated by years of conflict. Diplomacy extended beyond negotiations with leaders. It required careful communication with the public to justify decisions, secure funding, and maintain morale. Propaganda, media briefings, and speeches reinforced the idea that American engagement abroad was essential not only for victory but also for shaping a stable and prosperous global order after the war. The complexities of diplomacy were magnified by the nature of the Allied coalition itself. Differences in ideology, national interest, and military culture often created friction. Stalin's insistence on a rapid opening of a second front conflicted with Churchill's caution, born from Britain's hard-learned experience in Europe, while Roosevelt sought to mediate between the two. In the Pacific, American and Australian leaders negotiated strategies to counter Japanese advances, coordinate naval operations, and establish bases for future offensives. Across both theaters, intelligence sharing, communications, and joint planning became indispensable. The United States' ability to harmonize these diverse efforts showcased a level of organizational skill and strategic foresight that had rarely been required in previous conflicts. Another dimension of diplomacy during this period involved managing neutral or occupied nations. The U.S. worked to bolster resistance movements in Europe, support governments in exile, and provide aid to civilian populations suffering under occupation. These efforts were not purely humanitarian, they served strategic purposes by disrupting Axis operations, gathering intelligence, and fostering goodwill that would influence post-war alliances. The coordination of covert operations, supply drops, and political support required precision and secrecy, reflecting the multidimensional nature of modern warfare. American diplomats, military planners, and intelligence officers operated in parallel, ensuring that military campaigns were reinforced by political and logistical strategies. As 1944 approached, the fruits of diplomatic labor became evident. The planning for D-Day demonstrated unprecedented collaboration among nations, reflecting months of negotiation, reconnaissance, and logistical preparation. At the same time, economic initiatives from Bretton Woods laid the foundation for post-war recovery and stability. Roosevelt's vision for an active American role in shaping international institutions began to take form, signaling a transition from wartime coalition management to long-term global leadership. By uniting military, economic, and political strategies, the United States not only strengthened the Allied war effort but also positioned itself as a central architect of the world that would emerge after the guns fell silent. Through these diplomatic efforts, the United States demonstrated that modern warfare was as much about alliances, negotiations, and economic planning as it was about battles. Leaders recognized that victory required vision beyond immediate combat and that sustaining the war effort demanded careful coordination on multiple levels. Tehran, Bretton Woods, and related negotiations reflected an integrated approach to global conflict, a recognition that military success, economic stability, and political legitimacy were intertwined. The strategic and diplomatic decisions made in this period would define not only the outcome of World War II but also the post-war world, establishing frameworks that endure to this day. By the end of 1944, it was clear that diplomacy had become as decisive as firepower. American negotiators and leaders had successfully balanced conflicting priorities, managed complex alliances, and laid the groundwork for both victory and reconstruction. While the battles in Europe and the Pacific continued, the careful orchestration of strategy and diplomacy ensured that the United States would emerge from the war as a superpower, capable of shaping global events, rebuilding nations, and influencing the international system. In this sense, the war was not only a test of military might but also a demonstration of American ingenuity, foresight, and leadership on the world stage. Victory, transformation, and the post-war world. By 1945, the tide of World War II had decisively turned in favor of the Allies, but the final months of the conflict demanded relentless effort, strategic precision, and profound moral reckoning. Across Europe, the culmination of years of preparation, the D-Day invasion, the Italian campaigns, and the relentless push from the Eastern Front brought German forces to a breaking point. American troops, alongside British, Canadian, and other Allied forces, advanced into territories long under Nazi control, liberating cities and witnessing the horrifying aftermath of concentration camps. The war in Europe was not merely a military struggle, it was a confrontation with the consequences of unchecked ideology and a test of American leadership in orchestrating multinational operations with both speed and humanity. The success of these final offensives in Europe was a product of meticulous planning, industrial might, and coalition diplomacy. American production, now at its peak, had provided tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies on an unprecedented scale, ensuring that Allied forces were equipped to sustain long campaigns. The coordination between nations was equally remarkable. Armies, navies, and air forces operated in concert, demonstrating the effectiveness of combined operations conceived years earlier during conferences such as Tehran. Each liberated town, each breakthrough along the Rhine, represented the cumulative impact of strategy, logistics, and sacrifice. For the United States, this period solidified its role as a dominant military power, capable of projecting force across continents while sustaining the complex machinery of modern warfare. While Europe approached the end of its nightmare, the Pacific theater demanded continued innovation and ferocity. The island-hopping strategy had brought American forces ever closer to Japan, but each advance came at a staggering cost. Battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa illustrated the extreme challenges of amphibious warfare, entrenched defenders, treacherous terrain, and the relentless resolve of Japanese troops. Casualty rates were high, and planners faced agonizing decisions, balancing the human cost against the strategic imperative of forcing Japan's surrender. General Douglas MacArthur, Admiral Chester Nimitz, and their subordinates coordinated assaults with precision, using intelligence, naval gunfire, and air superiority to soften enemy positions. Every victory reinforced the lesson that modern warfare required integration across services, careful timing, and unwavering determination. As conventional campaigns dragged on, American scientists were quietly completing another front of the war, one that would redefine conflict forever. The Manhattan Project, a secret program initiated in 1942, had developed atomic weapons capable of unparalleled destruction. By mid-1945, with Germany already defeated, attention shifted entirely to Japan. President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office after Roosevelt's death, faced the most consequential decision in modern military history: whether to deploy atomic bombs to compel Japanese surrender and potentially save hundreds of thousands of American and Allied lives that a full-scale invasion would have cost. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to a rapid conclusion, forcing Japan's surrender while raising profound ethical and political questions about the future of warfare. These events demonstrated the United States' unprecedented scientific and military capabilities and ushered in the nuclear age, forever altering global power dynamics. The conclusion of the war presented new challenges: occupying territories, stabilizing governments, and laying the groundwork for post-war peace. In Europe, the Allied powers established occupation zones in Germany, seeking to dismantle the Nazi regime, prevent the resurgence of militarism, and rebuild infrastructure. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and economies required immediate assistance to avoid famine and social collapse. The United States, leveraging both its industrial capacity and diplomatic influence, contributed to reconstruction efforts, including supplying food, machinery, and financial support. These initiatives reflected an understanding that military victory alone was insufficient. Lasting peace required economic stability, political reform, and careful attention to humanitarian needs. The post-war period also highlighted the importance of international institutions that had been conceived during the war. The United Nations, officially established in October 1945, embodied the lessons of diplomatic cooperation learned through conferences like Tehran and Bretton Woods. Its mission to provide a forum for resolving conflicts, preventing aggression, and promoting human rights represented a commitment to global governance that transcended national interests. The United States assumed a central role in shaping these institutions, reflecting a broader vision that military, economic, and political leadership were interconnected. By investing in collective security and international cooperation, the U.S. positioned itself as a stabilizing force in a world emerging from unparalleled devastation. Domestically, the war had transformed American society in fundamental ways. Millions of men and women had entered military service, while industries expanded at a staggering pace. Labor shortages led to the integration of women and minority groups into positions previously closed to them, creating social shifts that would reverberate for decades. Technological innovations from jet engines to radar to medical advancements accelerated rapidly due to wartime needs. Economically, the United States emerged as the dominant industrial power, possessing the capacity not only to wage war but to shape post-war reconstruction globally. Socially and politically, the nation faced new expectations. Its citizens anticipated a return to prosperity, but also a broader role in shaping international norms and safeguarding democracy worldwide. The immediate post-war years also set the stage for emerging tensions that would define the next era. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, once united against a common enemy, began to show strain over issues such as occupation policies, the future of Eastern Europe, and influence in post-war Asia. While collaboration during the war had been crucial, divergent political systems and competing visions for global order sowed seeds of what would become the Cold War. The United States, equipped with unmatched economic and military power, prepared to confront these challenges through diplomacy, alliances, and strategic positioning, demonstrating that wartime experience had fundamentally reshaped its global responsibilities. The conclusion of World War II revealed the scale of American influence in shaping not just the outcome of the conflict but the architecture of the post-war world. Victory had been achieved through a combination of industrial mobilization, strategic foresight, and effective coalition building. Yet, it was equally a product of diplomacy, innovation, and the capacity to envision a stable, interconnected international system. The United States' ability to simultaneously fight a two-ocean war, coordinate with multiple allies, develop revolutionary weapons, and plan for reconstruction reflected unprecedented organizational sophistication. By 1945, America was no longer merely a participant in global affairs, it was a central actor capable of directing the course of history. Ultimately, the war's end did not mark the conclusion of responsibility, it signaled the beginning of a new chapter. American leaders had to reconcile the demands of military power with the imperatives of diplomacy, economic reconstruction, and global governance. The lessons of strategy, planning, and international cooperation learned during the conflict would influence foreign policy, economic planning, and defense strategy for decades. The nation had not only defeated the Axis powers but also positioned itself to shape a world order built on its values, capabilities, and vision. The transition from wartime leadership to peacetime stewardship would define the United States' role in the latter half of the 20th century, cementing its status as a superpower and shaping the global landscape for generations to come.